Good morning, folks. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech shehakol nהיה b'dברו.
לחיים.
Chaim v'bracha. Oh, okay. Uh, Okay, folks, we begin today a new discourse, mimer, or let the beat in. We are 2.5 weeks away from Purim, so let us prepare for Purim. This is a discourse given out in 1990. I said it earlier, but it was given out then. And it begins with the words, Balai lahu nadash nasamelech. On that night, the king's sleep was awoken. So the simple storyline is King Achashverosh.
King's sleep was awoken.
Oops. Here's some feedback. All right. The sleep of the king was awoken, and he couldn't sleep. So, as the story goes, he asked for the books of the king's court, to be read to him, and it was read to him that Mordecai had saved the life of the king because there were two guards that were plotting against the king. And he asked, did he ever get rewarded? Was there ever written down in the king's court's log? I said, no. And at that moment, then came in Haman, who wanted to hang Mordecai. And he says to him, the king says, Achashverosh says to Haman, his trusty servant, who made a decree against the Jewish people to kill them all in one day, in the 127 provinces that belonged to that basically the modern world, then the modern world that he was the king over, which was every single Jew in his 127 provinces. And he's coming that, he's not waiting. He wants to hang Mordecai now, who's the leader of the Jewish people, for insubordinance. And here Mordecai just saved his life. But he asks the question, the king to Haman, well, what do you do for the man who the king wants to show favor? So, of course, Haman thought it was him. And that the king wants to show favor to him. So he should write him, with the clothes of the king on the king's horse in the middle of town and say, this is what's done to a person who finds favor in the eyes of the king. He says, okay, go ahead and go do it to Mordecai. That was the turning point. That was the turning point in the whole story, right? Okay, that's the background of the story in the story of Purim. in the Megillah Esther, Megillah's Esther, in the scroll of Esther, where the story is told. So we need to understand, since it says Balayla Hahu, that night, right? Which seemingly it would have been sufficient just to say at night. Right, just say at night. I have to say that night. All right. We would know, from he didn't sleep at night, right? We would understand and we would understand the context of everything. But there's an emphasis here on that night. So, as the custom is brought down in Jewish law, that when you read those words, Balaylahu Nadadashnas Hamelech, on that night, the king's sleep was awoken, or he was awoken from sleep, rather. So the law is that you have to pick up your voice very loud, the one who's reading the Megillah on Purim, right? We have twice we read it, the night of Purim and then the day of Purim. This year it falls out on Thursday night, Friday, in 2.5 weeks. Let's just get the date here while we're talking. 14th, how do you like that? The 14th. So the 13th at night, Thursday night is the 13th after the fast of Esther. And then the 14th is Friday, which is also the 14th of the Jewish month. How do you like that? So the custom is raise your voice, because this is the main part of the miracle. Like this is the kind of like the crux of the miracle. Here's Haman coming, wanting to hang Mordechai, the leader of the Jews. And not only is he not hung, but he's being celebrated with the very suggestion of Haman on how to celebrate Mordechai. So it's brought down in the Medrash that this is the king was awoken from sleep, is a metaphor. The ultimate king was awoken, is the metaphor. God Almighty, he woke up from his sleep. Now, what does it mean, God having sleep? How does God sleep? Obviously, it's a metaphor, but what does that mean? So, as King Solomon says in the Song of Songs, he says, God, in reference to God, that I sleep, and the Zohar explains, in exile. Right? What does that mean? God reflects what the Jewish people are doing. If the Jewish people are sleeping, so God's asleep. We cause heaven to sleep when we're asleep. What does it mean that we're asleep? Sleeping means you don't see the virtue of the person, right? Sometimes, rambunctious kids, you love them when they go to sleep because they're not rambunctious, right? But the virtue of a person is when they're awake. When they're awake, the mind is awake. The mind has dominion over the heart, right? You're acting like a human. When you're awake, this is on top. This is affected from what's on top. the head affects the mind. The mind affects the heart, right? And therefore, what is the truth? The mind understands. What is responsibility? The mind understands. And therefore, it feeds the heart, where the heart may just want to be a comfort creature, a pleasure-seeking individual. Um, the mind has dominion and leads us to do the right thing, right? When you're sleeping, the mind and the heart and the rest of the body are on the same plane. There's no distinction. The mind isn't having control over the heart. That's why we have crazy dreams sometimes, right? If if you were awake and you were thinking it, you wouldn't think it, right? But you don't have control at night. At least we don't. Believe it or not, the righteous do. Or I don't know if that's control, but God gives them, you know, in any case. The point being, um, the virtue of the individual isn't seen when they're asleep, unless you're a rambunctious kid and your parents don't want to deal with you. Right? But that's not a virtue when you're sleeping. It's just they're not in your hair, right? They're not bothering you. But, we don't accomplish that much when we sleep except to regenerate ourselves, rejuvenate ourselves. And we need sleep. That's not the point over here. With the sleep, then you could, accomplish during the day, which thank God last night I got a good night's sleep. Now, so that's the metaphor of sleep. So when the Jewish people are asleep, we affect that God is asleep, meaning the light of God isn't shining in our lives. That's what it means. Because we're asleep in the sense that we're not, our mind isn't leading us to serve God properly. Right? Where do you see the virtue of the person that they're a servant of God when they're awake, when they're asleep? You don't see that. It's hidden. So this is what it means that when we're asleep in our divine service, so God is figuratively asleep, and the light of God doesn't shine upon us in all different ways, right? So we're affecting that. First of all, that idea, just to let that penetrate for a moment, how powerful that is, how our fate is dependent on us, on how um, we have a control not only over us, but over the spiritual, heavenly, divine spheres. So, therefore, now we can understand what does it mean that the sleep of the king above, the divine king, was awoken. That's why it's the main part of the miracle. Because on that night, when we were in exile, and we weren't exactly, you know, connected in the way we needed to till then we were, and then we became more connected to God, and therefore God became more connected to us. We became to shine his light. So now he's shining his light upon us. Now we can understand why it says Balailahu. We asked a question. Just saying that at night the king couldn't sleep and woke up from his sleep. I have to say that night because it shows on a deeper darkness. Lila, night, is itself darkness. It's a metaphor for the darkness of exile. But when you say who, which means that night, which is that night, it's also a concealment. When you say this night, so it's particular. It's this, it's like you point this, right? That means it's a particular thing that you're pointing out. That's, in other words, it's clearly identifiable, clearly there. That's like second person. You do this, right? Meaning the point bringing out over here, it's, it's clear, it's identifiable when you say, well, first of all, when there's you second person, when you say he third person, well, that's not clearly identifiable. He said, well, who's the he that said? Oh, you said. Oh, that's you. That's not he. You is identifiable, is clear. Third person isn't. So the same idea is when you say this, it's like in second person, right? This, identifiable, clear. When you say who, so the word who in Hebrew means he, and hahu means that one, that he. It's like third person, unidentifiable, concealed, hidden. It's like he's on first. What's on second? Right? Well, he, who he that's on first. Right? Because it's not, if he would say, you're on second, oh, that's identifiable, right? Then you wouldn't have the joke. Oh, that's good. So it's a double darkness because you have light, which a dark, night rather, which is a metaphor for darkness, and then you'll have who, a who, which is an that night. Again, like third person, it's from the word who, which means he. So it is. Um, so it's a double darkness. From that, God woke up from a double darkness that we were experiencing. What was a double darkness? Well, first of all, we were in a state of exile. We were the historic Purim happened in the 70 years between the destruction of the first Holy Temple and the building of the second Holy Temple. There was a 70-year period in between. We weren't on, the story doesn't take place in the land of Israel, it takes the land in Persia, modern day Iran, right? That's where it took place. We were not in control. We were under the Persian Empire, led by Ahasuerus. So again, so we have here double darkness. And even the word Esther, which is, when the Talmud, they ask, where do we see Esther in the Torah? Says God. God says, I will conceal, hide myself. It's a double hiding. In other words, in the hiddenness, there's still another hiddenness. So with that, we can appreciate now what it means that night of exile. That night of the hiddenness of God, he awoke. God's presence was palpable and real. Right? So when we say that night, so it just adds to the great miracle of it wasn't just dark of exile, but a double darkness, a decree against the Jewish people to annihilate them. And from that, you know, that the Jewish people were asleep in their divine service, but they woke up themselves from their sleep. As what happens when you sleep, you dream. And the dreams that you have are a lie. It's a lie, right? It's not real. So that metaphorically is that in a time of darkness, we don't live the truth. We live a lie. The lie being that we feel separate from God. The lie being that we feel that God isn't engaged in the world and in my life. The lie being that that there's nothing, that we don't feel that there's nothing else but him. The lie being that I can feel that I can control someone else rather than I can control myself, and the controlling myself, I can control heaven. And that creates a sleep. Also, when we live that lie of a dream at sleep, then when we sleep, that we think the dream is real, right? You wake up, sometimes you feel it. Wow, that dream. You almost take a double take. Was it real or was it not real? And from that, awoken from the sleep, the King, God Almighty. That's powerful. That's the power we have. When we're connected, we have that power.